Good afternoon, world. I'm Antonio Celaya. I'm with Cascadia Composers, a group based in Portland, Oregon, but with members across the country and perhaps even across the world. I'm based here in Oakland, California. I'm with David Bernstein, one of the founders and a composer with Cascadia Composers. He's based outside of Portland, Oregon. And we're going to talk today about David's musical career and his music, and then we're going to hear a little bit of it. This is the first in a series of pieces, series of programs, in which we're going to present Cascadia Composers to try and let the wider world know what Cascadia is and who the composers are who produce the music that Cascadia presents. Good afternoon, David.
Good afternoon, Tony. Pleasure to be with you.
It's a pleasure to be here. And I've brought a little cocktail here, and there's sort of a tradition of COVID these days of cocktails with composers, cocktails with curators, and so.
Mine comes later.
Okay. Well, I have a Creole cocktail here. Cheers.
Indeed.
And I should note that we are here under the lockdown conditions that are prevailing here in the middle of July of 2020. David, could you tell us a little bit about your musical career?
In my case, the beginnings were probably a little unusual because I didn't really come to music until I was about 21 years old. That is late for most people in a musical career. I initially wanted to become an actor, and I was on stage in plays during high school. I thought I might wind up going to either New York or Los Angeles to see if I could get into that world, that particular world at that time, at my age. But then as I went to school, and I did 1 year at a junior college level before transferring to a 4-year institution. Now, this was Florida State University in Tallahassee, Florida. And at that time, I began to seriously consider music, even though I knew I was so far behind the students that I met at the School of Music there and in any other place I went to. The thing that got me hooked, there really were two sources in this regard. I used to play accordion when I was younger, about 16, 17 years old, 15 maybe. And that was kind of funny the way that happened. I was living in Boston, and a salesman came to our door. My mother opened the door, and he was a guy with a suitcase. And he was selling accordion lessons. And my mother decided, well, that might be a good thing for me to do. So she bought accordion lessons for me, and I started on it. And I got pretty good at it. And I got to the point where I was playing pretty challenging pieces on the accordion. Then one day my teacher in Boston gave me a 5-minute transcription of Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue. Well, that piece blew me away. It was a lot different from the polkas, the waltzes, the variations, other kinds of things that I had been learning up to that point. So that just really made a stunning impression on me. And then later on, when I was living in Florida, I met a good friend. He was from England. He introduced me to Beethoven's 9 symphonies. And we would just be there at my house playing them one after another for as long as we could take it until a break was needed for whatever reason. And I was between Gershwin and Beethoven, pretty weird combination, but I was totally and completely, thoroughly hooked. So I think the first piece I ever really wrote was variations on Beethoven's Ode to Joy theme. So that's my own little set, and that's what I started with. I really knew nothing about writing, really nothing about music, but I was hooked, and I started in music at Florida State. And the only thing they could let me into was music theory, because I had no performance chops. The accordion was not an accepted member of their participation there.
Is it now?
I think it probably is. I'm not sure on that. I'd have to check. But certainly not at the time I went there. And music theory was the only thing they could let me go in. And that's what got me started in terms of learning about technique, the craft of composition, a whole variety of things. So I graduated there with a bachelor's, first with a bachelor's degree in music theory, and then a master's degree at the same university, also in music theory. Later on, when I went to Indiana University to work on a doctorate, well, they wouldn't let me do music theory. It was not the kind of thing that they thought I had any real talent, intuitive or otherwise, to do. But I had showed them some compositions, and they said, we'll let you be a composition major at the doctoral level. So that was that. And my first real job that I didn't think was going to be much of a job was at the University of Akron in Ohio. I was about 30 years old then. And when they hired me, it was to teach music theory classes, teach composition students. And it was a small school at the time I went there. I didn't think I'd stay there. I'd get some experience working there and then leave for a bigger, better school, whatever. But over time, the school really kind of exploded. From a music department, we became a school of music. We wound up having 400 music majors over time. And the faculty, which I helped to grow because I was in on the hiring of a lot of the, particularly applied music faculty members, we wound up having 38 full-time faculty and about 20 part-time faculty. And for me, as a composer, it was a terrific laboratory because I wound up writing for almost the entire music faculty. And I never had to pay a dime to have a piece recorded, performed, or whatever. I wrote orchestra works, I wrote a band work, I wrote pieces for chorus, and as well as an awful lot of chamber music for that school. And when I took an early retirement in the year 2000 from the University of Akron, the last thing I did before leaving was the composition of 3 one-act operas. That was a bit of a challenge. So that was the last thing that I did, and the early retirement then took me initially to Georgia for 6 years, which after that length of time I did not like, and I wanted to move out of that. The heat, humidity, the culture of what that part of the South represented. And my son at the time, my oldest son, was doing a medical residency here in Portland at Oregon Health and Science University in nephrology, the study of kidney disease. And so we would come out here to visit him. And when I said, boy, I want out of Georgia and this is where I want to go, the compromise between me and my wife is that we had to find an area that would be conducive to me getting into Portland for the arts that I had to have. And she's always, since she was a teenager, she's had horses. So we had to find a place with land. So about 35 minutes outside, northern part of outside of Portland, we found a 5-acre place and we built a home and we had enough land for the horses and it was an easy enough drive for me to get into Portland. So when I got into Portland then, having come initially from the Cleveland, Ohio area where I was in the Cleveland Composers Guild for many years, when I got out here, a friend of mine put me in contact with the person that was the principal bass player of the Oregon Symphony. And I knew him pretty well back in Akron because he was the director of the orchestra at our school. So he was the first one I contacted to find out what was going on here and who else as composer I could contact. And he put me in touch with Tomas Svoboda. And I went over to see him at his house. Very friendly guy. Initially, we talked a long time. He gave me the name of a lot of composers in that area. And I got their email addresses and I started writing and calling them to see if essentially there was an organization here, sort of like the Cleveland Composers Guild, that I could join.
Just so people know outside of Portland, Tomas Svoboda is sort of a regional star. He's from the Czech Republic originally, I guess.
Yes, he was born in Paris, but he is from the Czech Republic. Yes,
and he has very deep and traditional European musical education.
Yes,
and he's been something of a guiding force behind a lot of Northwestern composers.
Yes, very much so. A great guy. And from his references, I started calling people and we started having meetings. And there were some people that had been here a long time in universities and were very much opposed to the idea of starting a composing group in Portland. I will not go into any names here.
What were the reasons that they would oppose such a thing?
Invading their turf. Let's leave it at that. They didn't want any kind of competitive aspect of a group coming with other composers that might be interested, that they either didn't know about or didn't want to hear about. So anyway, over time, over many meetings, there were about 7 or 8 of us that really started to get something going. And we got some seed money to do this. We got, I think it was $200 from the National Association of School of Composers USA, NACUSA for short. And they gave us this money. We started meeting. Greg Steinke was very helpful in letting us know the details of many things because he has had so much administrative experience besides all his compositional work. And others, Gary Nolan, Jeff Winslow, Bonnie, Mitch, and who else? Gary Nolan, I think I mentioned. Dan Sen was another, Jack Gable was another. So there was a core group of about 8 of us. And we somehow, on next to nothing in the way of a budget, started to get some concerts going.
And I should note that that group you met listed is an interesting mixture of people with academic careers and composers with wholly unrelated day jobs who've been trying to churn out the music still.
That is totally correct. Yes. When I was in the Cleveland area, and Akron, Ohio was just about 30 miles south of Cleveland, Don Erb, composer of renown, and he used to head the meetings up there. And so in the Cleveland area, you have to know that there was a rather intense group of 6 schools of music there. To just briefly go into it, Cleveland had the Cleveland Institute of Music, where we had many meetings, the Cleveland State University, which is very, very strong. To its eastern side were schools like Oberlin, and there was another conservatory in that region. To the west of Cleveland was Kent State University with a School of Music, mostly focusing on music education type things. Just to the southeast of Kent was us, directly below Cleveland, where, as I say, we built up a school that had 400 music majors. So the composers from all these schools, with the exception of Oberlin, they never got involved with us. But the rest of us from these 5 schools would go up to Cleveland for these meetings, and we'd have concerts. A lot of them were in the Cleveland area. Some were down in Akron. Some out in the western areas of Cleveland, and they had been established for, when I got there, close to 50 years. So that's why when I came out and moved out here, I said, "Is there something like a Cleveland Composers Guild that I could join?" And when people said, "No, there is nothing," I said, "Well, okay, let's see if we can make something happen. Let's see if there's interest here." And so that's essentially more of a context for how what I did with others. I didn't do this alone. Helped make this happen. And I initially thought that, well, okay, maybe we would have 12, maybe 15 members over time if we started to become successful. I had no idea that we'd grow as big as we are with over 90-something members or something like that.
Maybe we can talk a little bit about your musical. You've produced some pieces in some of the bigger forms, pieces for orchestra, and the 3 one-act operas you mentioned. Now, you were a student, composition student of Carlisle Floyd,
yes.
Whose operas are still performed from time to time in some of the big houses. Mm-hmm. I think he still is considered one of our principal opera composers here in the United States. Perhaps he's not. Perhaps he isn't quite as popular as he once was, but he's hardly forgotten.
No, he's still, yeah, he's getting up there in age, late
He's
80s
still
now.
alive.
He is still very much alive.
Wow.
And so the last time I had an interesting talk with him because when my 3-act operas were going to be done up in Akron, I got in touch with him and asked if there was going to be a big thing around these 3 1-act operas. There were going to be lectures, there were going to be a whole variety of things. And we wanted a main speaker for it. And my first thought was Carlisle Floyd. So I got in touch with him and he agreed to come up for it. And unfortunately, about 4 days before that was to happen, no, it was longer than that. It was about maybe a week or 2 before that was to happen. He called me back and he said he had just heard that the Paris Opera Company was going to do his work, I think it was Of Mice, of Men. And so he had to go out to Paris. So he really, really apologized to me that he could not come up to Akron for this event of mine. Instead, we got another person that was also has had some success in opera, and Bob Woodward. No, Bob. Oh, I'm sorry, I cannot remember his name right now. But he came up, and he was at the time in his early 90s, and he came up. He was living, I believe, in North Carolina at the time. Oh, Ward. Ward is the name. The last name.
Whose opera, The Crucible, is a mainstay of university opera companies around the country.
The Crucible, and he came up, and he was a lovely man. We got along really, really well. So he gave the main talk, and we had a bunch of meetings. It was a symposium. All kinds of stuff happened over a initially 3-day period. And the operas I had done, there were 6 performances over 2 consecutive weekends. So it was a lot of fun, a lot of work. It involved almost the entire School of Music in doing this. The chorus groups, they had at the year this is going to be done in 1999 actually, that year, we happened to have, me being very lucky, a very, very strong choral department, very, very strong voice department. The university orchestra was not quite as strong as what we had had in previous years, but still, for me, with the singers, it was the absolute joy of my life. Most of my work was instrumental up until that time, although I had written a number of songs. But to do this much work on 3 1-act operas that involved so much singing, and to work with those singers who were in many ways so superb, some of whom went on to have some very successful opera careers.
What were the subjects of your operas?
What?
What were the subjects?
The subjects were Nathaniel Hawthorne, stories written by Nathaniel Hawthorne, and your friend and mine, Edgar Allan Poe. It was called Poe 2, Hawthorne 1. That was the title of the trilogy behind it. And the Poe works, the 2 1-act operas by Poe, one was The Telltale Heart, very famous, and the other one was a comedy by Poe, and I know that strikes people as somewhat strange, and it was not even what people would call a black comedy.
Was it funny?
It was indeed funny, and for me, I had my work cut out. Really, really cut out, because the work I did on the Poe work titled The Telltale Heart, that was a very, very intense piece of writing for me. It was featured for a virtuoso baritone with a chamber orchestra. And the comedy called A Method for Madness, based on this comedy, this other story by Poe, that was a totally different challenge. And that involved an awful lot of people. Choral, there was something like 18 soloists in it that would combine into duets, trios, larger ensemble combinations for it. Both works were about 35 minutes each. The piece I did on the Nathaniel Hawthorne work was a 50-minute work. So it was a chunk of writing. And once upon a time, I had said, I don't like opera that much. I really would never do something like that. I don't particularly like the contemporary operas I had heard. But one time when I was in New York, I met a librettist. I don't do not even remember at this point in time how I came to meet this guy. But we were both in the city, and we were introduced to each other. We met and we started talking. And I found out later that this guy, Charles Condek, is a librettist with a lot of success.
Yeah.
He's had work done at the Chicago Lyric Theater, the Santa Fe Opera Company, City Center in New York, and other places. So he's got, I guess, what you would call credibility. And he asked if he could send me some librettos when I got back home. And some of the stuff he sent me, I just couldn't begin to relate to. But the one from the Nathaniel Hawthorne short story struck a chord in me. It had to do with repression, religious bigotry, and it dated back to the 18th century. So that's the parameter, or the time parameter for what that story involved. So that got me going. So I started with that. And the Poe works that came after it, just in very different ways, both got me totally involved. And I had terrific support from the entire School of Music.
In composing them, did the words of Carlisle Floyd, or did his work and his sense of structure come back to you?
No. It was what he did, and I'm very, very impressed with what I've heard him do, is very different from the stuff I did. He was the first one I studied with. That is true. And I took, I kind of remember this stuff, kind of funny. Again, I was pretty green at Florida State University, where he was teaching there until he left to move to Houston, the Houston Opera Company. But I took 2 courses with him. I took piano studies with him. And coming from the accordion, it was a little different. And the other thing I did was composition lessons from him. Well, I got the grades after the first semester was over, studying with him. And he gave me a B in piano. And I was pleased with that because I didn't know how he might feel toward me in what I was doing.
And you really weren't a pianist.
I know, I was not. I was really, really beginning. But in composition, to my stunning surprise, he gave me an A. And that really blew me away because he had this reputation of being rather tough on students that he came across with. So anyway, that was my first introduction to Carlisle Floyd, and he went on to have an incredibly successful career, primarily with the Houston Opera. And he told me that, the older he gets, the more he found his opera works getting performed. And so it was just my luck that when he was going to come up to where I was having that symposium on my 3 one-act operas, he had to instead go to a place called Paris to hear one of his stuff. So
rough life.
It is rough, yes. Very
so, rough. Would it be fair to say your musical heart is sort of in the heart of the Central European repertoire?
I think probably, yeah. I can tell you the early influences on me, there were 3. I give a lot of credit to Arnold Schoenberg in the period that we call his freely atonal writing, his use of pitch cells. That really got me very, very attracted.
Pierrot period.
The Pierrot period, yeah. And that struck me. The writing of Stravinsky was another major influence. And I was really pretty stunned with Stravinsky's ability to do what he could do with an orchestra or a chamber group. That was really impressive. And the third person was Bela Bartok. I loved his sense of rhythm. I loved the harmonies. I loved the intensity of the music that he wrote. And so, sort of to wrap this aspect up, it was those 3 that I think really got me going and were the influences. Is some of all 3 in my own music? Oh, the Schoenberg part is there in terms of harmonically what I like to use. But I don't think anybody's going to say it sounds like Arnold Schoenberg. And Stravinsky, it's the way I use instruments, that's still me. I'm nowhere near what he was able to do with instruments. And Bartok, well, I think the love
century for my money.
Is what?
Bartok, for my money, is the most underrated composer of the 20th century.
Yeah, I would most certainly agree with that. But the man is so passionate in his rhythmic drive and so many of the other things that I got to know of his works. The six string quartets, I used to teach the fourth one and part of the first movement of the sixth quartet. And wow, what an introduction to string quartet writing in terms of 20th century, at the time, 20th century music. And so those three, though, were the really big influences.
Before we move on to your piece and talking about the piece that we're going to play here at the end, um, you your academic career extended over at least part of what I think is now perceived to be the big stylistic battles of the second half of the 20th century.
Yeah.
Did those stylistic battles affect you? Did you find yourself caught in the middle of them without ever wishing to be, or?
Not really. I kind of pretty much went my own way. I did dabble in 12-tone serial techniques, and I found that it didn't suit me because I really couldn't hear it. I just could not hear it and feel it the way I can with smaller pitch class sets, 3 notes, 4 notes, 5 notes. So serialism did not really do it for me, and I still consider very much, although my music might be generally said to be freely chromatic, it's still tonal, without getting too much into that. And hopefully, whatever I do as a composer, it's going to sound like me. I seem to have found a voice that suits me. And although I've synthesized Schoenberg, Bartók, and Stravinsky, along with others, of course, what I write is still got to be convincingly me, or I will not accept it. I will not do it. Now, there's another side to me that I have found to be very pleasurable, and that's writing works that are very, very tonal, and that's writing works for students, for young students, and that's why this In Good Hands recitals that we have done, I've written for them.
Could you explain to the listeners what the In Good Hands recitals are?
All right, I'll go back a little bit to Cleveland. And living in the Cleveland area, the Cleveland Institute of Music used to sponsor this high school kind of music school settlement. Cleveland Music School Settlement is what it was called. This would be from 12th grade down, almost to kindergarten. Students that would be filtering through the settlement that would eventually go into and be accepted by the Cleveland Institute of Music. Well, the Cleveland Composers Guild worked out an arrangement with them so that composers in the guild that wanted to could write for those students. And they would be paid. The commissions were small, about $100 each, I think, for the composer. But they could write a piano piece, they could write a violin piece, a work for a singer, a work for 3 instruments, 2 instruments, whatever. And then every April, they would be performed at the Cleveland Institute of Music. And the composers before that would meet with the teacher as well as the student. After the teacher called up the composers to say, okay, my student's ready, come up and hear them and offer whatever guidance you want. And so that was my first involvement in doing something like that. So out here, when we had the Cascadia group getting involved with doing what it was doing, I thought, what about something that could be educational, involve young students, and our Cascadia composers writing directly for them? And I had a meeting with Harold Gray, who at that time was head of the Portland Piano International Forum, and we had several discussions. Tomas Svoboda got in on the discussions to help out, and we started, and it was Harold that got the group name going. He came up with In Good Hands, and it seemed like a perfect title for what we wanted to do.
Cascadia presented a Good Hands concert
Yes.
a week and a half ago, and you had 2 or 3 pieces, I think, on that concert.
Had 2 pieces on it, right? Yes.
Insofar as all these kids playing in their living rooms constitutes a concert.
Yeah, right.
And I recall you had a piece that evoked a music box played by a little girl in a very fancy dress.
Yes, wasn't she stunning? Wasn't she
Yeah,
stunning?
she played wonderfully.
Yes, she did. And I was kind of surprised that's not that easy a piece, actually. And it mostly focuses almost entirely on the upper register of the piano, this little pseudo tinkling kind of music box idea that I had. And it's actually part of one of 8 pieces in this collection of piano works that I wrote for students. So yeah, she was given this piece to write as later on a 17-year-old boy was given a different piece to work on. He did that very well. And so that was fun. And I've had a number of pieces played down through the years on the In Good Hands recitals. And of course, you know, the way we now have to do them is not ideal by any means. You don't want to have 21 pieces played with maybe 21 different pianos, maybe 21 pseudo different tuning systems, and that sort of thing. You want all these kids to come out on stage in front of their peers, in front of their parents and the audience, and play one well-tuned piano.
But I think all those kids put their hearts into every piece.
They did. They
They
did.
did a wonderful job. And
really,
I believe it's posted somewhere on the internet at present. Cascadia, by the way, has a large number of pieces of past concerts posted on the web, including pieces of yours.
Yeah.
If we can just briefly now, before we get to your piece, the piece that we're going to play of yours it's a performance of a piece that was written, I understand, for a concert that was to commemorate the centennial of the death of Debussy in 2017. And your piece is called Reflux, Flow and Reflow. Is that
Ebb and flow. Ebb and flow.
Ebb and flow.
Yeah.
And would it be fair to say that your piece is something of an energetic lament?
In a way, I think that would be fair. I start off, I mean, it has a number of different sections, and that goes back to the ebb and the flow of it. There were actually something unusual that I did in some respects. There are actually 2 C major chorales in the piece, 2 functional C major chorales with added tones that make it a little bit different in that sense. One is short, the other is longer, and I developed them somewhat. There are some mannerisms like parallel chords and that sort of thing that, of course, Debussy did use. And then there's some other things that Debussy would not go near. And this piece still had to be me. It was in memory of him, as great a composer as he is. And so I did sort of borrow some of his stylistic things, but most of it is still really me. And I just develop it my own way. It ends in a rather tumultuous rhythmic aspect to it.
Well, what struck me about it was I was rather taken by the sort of fanfare you had at the beginning that recurred.
Yes.
And I was also taken by the fact that every figure in it the whole piece seems to consist of rising figures that somehow or other still never managed to get off the end of the keyboard.
Not quite. There is also, I don't know if you caught it, but there is one very famous tune of Debussy's that I use. I use it in 3 different areas. And at first, it's in the bass, and it comes right out of the first movement of L'avenir. It's a very clear, it's very, for those that really know that piece well, it is absolutely recognizable. But then in 2 other areas, I very much disguise it. The pitch material is all there from this one particular theme of his, but it's disguised.
Do the fanfares mean something in particular?
No, they just have my own expression. When I write, 2 of the things I'm very conscious of when I write is texture, of how far one goes before the textual relationship of one voice to another changes, and rhythm. Although with rhythm, it's something that I don't really plan for. It is something I feel, literally. Pitch, I'm very conscious of, and texture, I'm very conscious of knowing And I'll tell you who my great teacher in this was, in the textural aspect, and that's Beethoven. I've never come across another composer with his extraordinary sense of timing, of knowing how far to go before something must change. And he's always at the back of my mind.
Not even Stravinsky?
No, not in that respect. Not in that respect. Form is another kind of thing, but that is wrapped up with texture and knowing when to change something, knowing hopefully
Knowing when to stop.
knowing when, yeah, to stop, to change something, how to end a piece. Now, there's a big thing. That's the thing that really almost terrorizes me when I'm working on a piece. And I get to the point where I know I have to somehow tell the audience that the piece is going to be not stopping, but ending. That scares me. You may call it a coda, you may call it something different. But that's what I really worry about when I get to that spot. I know I'm at that spot, first of all, and how do I do it? How do I successfully let the audience know I'm going to be bringing this piece to a close?
Well, thank you, David. I want to thank you for talking with us today. We're going to move on. We're going to play your piece and end the this interview with your piece, Flow and Reflow. And you have a number of pieces out on YouTube in the Cascadia section. Is any of your music available in other places where people could go find it?
Well, this coming week, I'm going to be sending 8 pieces to somebody from the CUSA that wanted me to put together a list of links of pieces that they would play on their radio setup. I'm not sure how it would be done. It would be done on a rotating basis with other composers' works. And the person that wrote to me, a guy named David Peoples from the CUSA, he just wants links, because actually when you click on a link, it'll open up and tell you the name of the piece and the performers on it, the title, the length, whatever. And so I've been prepared. This past week, I've been preparing a list of 8 pieces that are all on YouTube. And I have other pieces on YouTube, but these are the ones I think I've had some of the best performances ever. And by the way, the piece that you are going to play features this woman, Asha Galua, who is one of the strongest pianists I have ever had the pleasure to meet and to work with. She is just wonderful. When she first started performing in the Portland area, she and her husband live in Salem. But when she started performing up here, she made such an impression that everybody in our group now wants to use her. So it's going to be busy.
Well, thank you, David. Thank you very much. And we look forward to hearing more of your music in the near future.
Thanks so much, Tony.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.